The rain in Chicago doesn't wash anything clean. It only turns the grime into a slick, reflective oil that mirrors the neon sins of the city. I sat in the back of a black Cadillac, the leather upholstery smelling of expensive tobacco and the metallic tang of a life I never asked for but wore like a second skin. My name is Dante Moretti, and in this city, that name isn't just a label, it's a sentence. As the eldest son of the Moretti crime family, my life is governed by the Omertà and the heavy weight of a legacy built on bone and betrayal. My father, the Don, sat beside me, his silence more deafening than the thunder rolling over the Lake Michigan shoreline. We were heading to the neutral zone, a high-end social club called the Gilded Cage, to discuss a border dispute with the Romanov bratva. I checked the action on my Beretta, the cold steel a comfort against my thigh. I wasn't looking for a fight, but in my world, peace is just the interval between two wars. I stared out the window, watching the blur of the South Side, thinking about the ghosts of the men I'd had to handle to keep our territory secure. Every drop of blood on my hands was a payment to the family, a sacrifice to the altar of loyalty. But tonight the air felt different. It felt like a trap, or perhaps something far more dangerous, a beginning. The Gilded Cage was a masterpiece of velvet and vice, a place where the city's monsters wore tuxedos and sipped vintage scotch. I stepped out of the car, my coat billowing in the wind, and scanned the perimeter. My brother Lorenzo gave me a sharp nod from the entrance. He was the fire to my ice, always itching for a reason to pull a trigger. Inside, the jazz was low and smoky, a sultry saxophone mourning something that hadn't died yet. We moved to the private back room, the inner sanctum, where the air was thick with the scent of lilies and gunpowder. And there she was. Sitting across from my father's empty chair was Elena Romanov, the daughter of our greatest rival. I had seen her in photos, heard whispers of the Ice Queen of the North Side, but the pictures were flat, lifeless things compared to the woman before me. Her hair was the color of a midnight sky, and her eyes held a ferocity that made my pulse stutter. She didn't look like a mob princess. She looked like a sovereign. As our eyes met, the room seemed to shrink until it was just the two of us, caught in a crossfire of unspoken history. I knew then that the business proposition my father mentioned was merely a cover for the storm brewing in my chest. "Dante," she said, her voice a low purr that carried the weight of a threat and a promise. "I expected your father to send a diplomat, not a hatchet man." I pulled out a chair, my movements deliberate and slow, never taking my eyes off hers. "The diplomat is busy burying the last person who crossed our line, Elena. You get me instead." The tension in the room was a living thing, a coiled snake ready to strike. We were supposed to be discussing the shipment rights for the waterfront docks, but all I could focus on was the way she tilted her head, challenging me to step into her orbit. Our families had been at each other's throats for 3 generations. My grandfather had supposedly ordered the hit on her gray tuncle, a story told in hushed tones at every Morty Sunday dinner. To love a Romanov wasn't just a betrayal, it was a death wish. But as she leaned forward, the light catching the gold pendant at her throat, I realized that the danger didn't come from her guards or her father's reach. It came from the way she looked at me, like she knew exactly what kind of monster I was, and she wasn't afraid. "Let's drop the pretenses, Dante," Elena whispered, leaning closer so only I could hear over the low hum of the club. "Your father wants the docks, and my father wants the warehouse district, but we both know that neither of them will stop until the other is in the ground." I watched the way her lips moved, the subtext of her words sharper than any blade. She was talking about war, but her eyes were talking about something entirely different. "And what do you want, Elena?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous register. Beside my head on a silver platter, she laughed, a short, breathless sound that sent a jiver down my spine. Your head is far too valuable to be on a platter. I'd rather have it. Closer! The audacity of her words in a room full of armed men was staggering. She was playing with fire in a room full of gasoline. I felt the familiar pull of duty, the voice of my father in the back of my head reminding me that she was the enemy, a beautiful toxin. Yet I found myself reaching out, my fingers grazing the silk of her sleeve. It was a declaration of war against my own blood. I remember the first time I saw my father kill a man. I was 12. We were in the basement of an old bakery in Little Italy, the smell of fresh bread mixing with the copper scent of blood. The man had begged for mercy, citing his wife and children. My father hadn't blinked. He told me that mercy was a luxury for those who didn't have a legacy to protect. He made me watch as he ended it, then handed me a cloth to wipe the splash from my shoes. "A Morty never lets his heart lead his hand," he'd said. That memory flared in my mind as I sat across from Elena. I saw the same cold steel in her eyes that I'd seen in my father's that day. She was raised in the same crucible of violence. We were two predators sensing a kindred spirit, or perhaps two victims of the same dark machine. The flashback faded, leaving me back in the gilded cage, staring at the woman who represented everything I was supposed to hate. The irony wasn't lost on me. The only person who truly understood the weight of my crown was the one person I was forbidden to touch. The meeting devolved into the usual posturing and veiled threats between our lieutenants. I watched the clock, the minutes ticking toward a destiny I couldn't outrun. Every time our hands brushed near the shared map on the table, a jolt of electricity surged through me. It was more than attraction. It was a recognition of souls forged in the same fire. "This arrangement is temporary," my father growled, standing up to signal the end of the sit-down. "We will revisit the terms in 72 hours. Elena stood, her posture regal, her eyes never leaving mine. "I look forward to it, Don Morty," she said, but her gaze lingered on me a second too long. As the room cleared, I stayed behind, pretending to gather my notes. Elena lingered by the door, her security detail waiting in the hall. "You're playing a dangerous game, Dante," she murmured, sensing I was watching her. "The most dangerous games have the best rewards," I countered. I walked toward her, the space between us charged with a magnetic force. We stood in the shadows of the velvet curtains, the muzzle of the city's night pressing against the glass. "If we're seen together like this, the truce ends before the ink is dry," I warned, though I didn't move away. Elena stepped closer, the scent of her perfume, jasmine and something sharp like ozone, filling my lungs. "The truce is a lie anyway. We're just waiting for someone to blink." She reached up, her hand hovering near my jaw, a gesture of intimacy that felt like a betrayal of every code I'd ever sworn to uphold. "Are you going to blink, Dante?" Her touch was light, a mere ghost of a sensation, but it burned hotter than a brand. I grabbed her wrist, my grip firm but not bruising. I should have pushed her away. I should have reported her insolence to the consigliere. Instead, I pulled her closer, the darkness of the room swallowing us whole. "I don't blink, Elena. I endure." The subtext was clear. I would endure the war, the hatred, and the heritage, but I wouldn't endure a life where I didn't know what it felt like to have her. Our faces were inches apart, the air shimmering with the heat of 1,000 forbidden thoughts. The second flashback hit me like a physical blow. It was the night my younger sister, Sophia, was caught in the crossfire of a drive-by. She wasn't part of the business. She was just a girl walking home from a movie. I was the one who found her, her white dress soaked in crimson, her eyes wide with a confusion that haunts my dreams. That was the night I truly became a soldier. I hunted down the men responsible, one by one, until the streets ran red with the price of their mistake. I learned then that love in our world is a liability, a weakness that the enemy will always exploit. Seeing Elena now, I felt that same terrifying vulnerability. She was a weapon pointed straight at my heart, and yet I found myself wanting to pull the trigger. If I let her in, I wasn't just risking my life. I was risking the stability of my entire family. But as her thumb traced the line of my lower lip, the ghosts of the past seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the thrumming reality of the present. "You're thinking about the cost," Elena whispered, her eyes searching mine. "I can see the tally marks in your head." I let go of her wrist, only to slide my hand into her hair, tilting her head back. "The cost is higher than you think. My father would see us both in concrete for this." She didn't flinch. "My father would do worse. He prides himself on his creativity with traitors." We were standing on the edge of a precipice, looking down into an abyss of blood and fire. "Why me?" I asked, a genuine question breaking through my mask of stoicism. "Of all the men in this city, why the one who is sworn to destroy your house?" Elena's expression softened for a fraction of a second, revealing a glimmer of the woman beneath the mob princess. "Because you're the only one who looks at me and sees a person, not a piece on a chessboard. And because I think you're just as tired of the shadows as I am." It was a confession wrapped in a challenge, a truth that resonated in the hollow spaces of my soul. I thought about the warehouse district, the abandoned piers where we did our business. The rust, the cold, the constant fear of a knife in the dark. My life was a series of calculations, of power plays and strategic retreats. There was no room for tenderness, no space for anything that didn't serve the Morty name. To even speak to her like this was a violation of the Omertà. If Lorenzo walked in, he'd be obligated to report me. But the thrill of the forbidden was a drug more potent than anything we sold on the corners. "The shadows are all I've ever known," I said, my voice husky. "I don't know how to live in the light." Elena smiled, a sad, knowing curve of her lips. "Who said anything about the light, Dante? We can create our own darkness." She leaned in, her breath warm against my skin, and for a moment the world outside, the rivalries, the contracts, the blood feuds, ceased to exist. There was only the sound of our breathing and the heavy, rhythmic thumping of my heart against my ribs. The third memory surfaced, a meeting of the commission 5 years ago. I was being inducted as a made man. The ceremony was solemn, a rite of passage that involved a burning picture of a saint and a drop of blood on the floor. I swore to be loyal to the family above all else, above God, above country, and definitely above love. I remembered the coldness of the oath, the feeling of the cage door slamming shut. I was a Morty first, a man second. Looking at Elena now, I felt that oath cracking. She was a crack in the foundation of my reality, a beautiful flaw that threatened to bring the whole structure down. I knew what I had to do. I had to walk away. I had to maintain the distance. But the gravity of her presence was too strong. I was caught in her orbit, and the re-entry was going to be lethal. "We shouldn't do this," I murmured, even as I leaned closer, my forehead resting against hers. "This ends in a graveyard, Elena, for both of us." Her hands found the lapels of my tuxedo, pulling me toward her with a strength that surprised me. "Everything in our world ends in a graveyard, Dante. At least this way we choose how we get there." The logic was flawed, desperate, and absolutely intoxicating. We were two doomed souls finding a moment of reprieve in the middle of a battlefield. The tension was unbearable, a bowstring stretched to the breaking point. I could hear the muffled sounds of the club outside, the clinking of glasses and the roar of the city, but in here, time had stalled. I was a man who lived by rules, and she was the one rule I was about to break. It wasn't just a kiss we were leaning into. It was a declaration of war against our own destinies. "I have to go," I said, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. "My men are waiting." Elena nodded, her eyes dark with a mix of understanding and disappointment. "And mine. But this isn't over, Dante. We've started something that can't be stopped by a border or a name." I turned to leave, my hand on the doorknob, when she spoke one last time. "Be careful on the way home. The streets are never as quiet as they seem." I glanced back, seeing her standing there, a silhouette against the dim light of the club. She looked like a queen, but she felt like a ghost. I stepped out into the hallway, my face settling back into the mask of the Morty air. But inside, I was a man coming apart at the seams. I found Lorenzo and the others, their faces grim. "Everything settled?" Lorenzo asked, searching my expression for any sign of weakness. "For now," I replied, my voice steady. "But keep the men on high alert. Something is shifting." As we walked toward the exit, the air in the club felt stifling. I needed the cold rain, the biting wind of the Chicago night to clear my head. We stepped out onto the sidewalk, the black Cadillacs idling at the curb like waiting predators. I felt eyes on me, not from the Romanov guards, but from somewhere in the shadows of the alley across the street. A premonition of danger clawed at the back of my neck. I thought about Elena's warning. The city was a maze of secrets, and I had just added the biggest one of all to my collection. I climbed into the car, the door shutting with a heavy thud, sealing me back into my world. I looked at my reflection in the window, the cold eyes, the sharp jaw, the look of a man who held the power of life and death. But for the first time in my life, I felt like a prisoner in my own skin. I shouldn't have gone back. After we dropped my father at the estate, I told Lorenzo I needed to check on a late-night shipment at the docks, but my hands turned the wheel toward the gilded cage instead. I knew she'd still be there. I knew she was waiting for the same thing I was. I parked the car blocks away and moved through the rain-slicked alleys like a shadow. I found the service entrance, slipping past a distracted bouncer with the ease of a man who knew every blind spot in the city. I found her in the narrow corridor leading to the dressing rooms, her coat on, ready to depart through the back. When she saw me, she didn't act surprised. She just stopped, her breath catching in the quiet space. "You came back," she whispered, the rain on her hair shimmering like diamonds under the flickering yellow bulb of the hallway. "I couldn't leave it like that," I said, stepping into her space, my presence commanding and urgent. "I told myself I was coming here to warn you, to tell you to stay away, but I'm a liar." She didn't say anything. She just reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as they touched my chest. I didn't hesitate this time. I closed the distance, my mouth crashing against hers in a kiss that tasted of desperation, rain, and the metallic tang of forbidden fruit. It was a collision of two worlds, a spark that threatened to ignite the entire city. It was the best and worst thing I had ever done. It was the kiss that changed everything. When I finally pulled away, gasping for air, the reality of what we'd done hit me like a physical weight. "Run, Elena," I said, my voice cracking for the first time. "Run as far as you can, because if I see you again, I won't be able to let you go." She looked at me, her eyes wide and wet with rain, and then she turned and vanished into the darkness of the alley. I stood there, the taste of her still on my lips, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I felt a strange sense of liberation, followed immediately by a chilling dread. I turned to make my own escape, my mind racing with the logistics of what I'd just invited into my life. I reached into my coat pocket for my keys, but my fingers brushed against something else, a folded piece of paper I hadn't noticed before. I pulled it out, the ink slightly blurred by the damp air. It wasn't a note from Elena. It was a document typed on heavy bond paper, the kind my father used for official business. My eyes scanned the list of names, the contracts that had been finalized this evening. My breath hitched as I reached the bottom of the page. There, highlighted in a cold, clinical red, was a name I knew better than my own. It was her name, Elena Romanov, and right next to it, under the column marked Contractor, was mine. I wasn't just her lover, I was her assigned executioner. I tried to run after her, the kiss still burning on my lips, until I found the hit list with my name on it. The paper felt heavier than the gun in my waistband. I stood in that rain-slicked alleyway, the ghost of Elena's lips still searing my own, while my eyes fixed on the cold, printed reality of her death warrant. It wasn't just a contract. It was a test. My father, the Don, hadn't just handed me a target. He had handed me a leash. He knew, or he suspected. In the Moretti family, there are no coincidences, only messages wrapped in shadows. I crumpled the list in my fist, the dampness of the Chicago night seeping into the fibers. My heart, which had been racing with the rush of the kiss, now froze into a block of jagged ice. I was the contractor. I was the one chosen to eliminate the only woman who made me feel like something other than a weapon. I looked toward the mouth of the alley where Elena had vanished, the urge to scream her name fighting against the ironclad discipline of 20 years of Omertà. I had to run. I had to find her before the clock started ticking, before my father sent someone else to check why the hit was taking so long. The drive back to the Moretti estate was a blur of neon lights and static on the radio. Every red light felt like a cage. Beside me, the empty passenger seat mocked the memory of the jasmine scent she'd left behind. If I didn't pull the trigger, I was a traitor. If I did, I was a ghost. There is no middle ground in the Mafia. You are either the hammer or the nail. I pulled into the long, gated driveway, the headlights of the Cadillac sweeping over the stone lions that guarded our fortress. My brother Lorenzo was waiting on the porch, a cigarette dangling from his lips. He watched me get out of the car with a gaze that was far too sharp for 3 in the morning. "You were gone a long time, Dante," he said, the smoke curling around his head like a halo of ash. "The docks didn't take 4 hours. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. Trouble with the shipment," I lied, the words tasting like lead. "Handled it." Lorenzo didn't move. "Father is in the study. He's waiting for a confirmation. You know how he gets when the paperwork isn't filed." I walked past him, the tension between us thick enough to bleed. The study smelled of old books, expensive cognac, and the lingering scent of my father's power. Don Pietro Moretti sat behind the mahogany desk, his face a map of scars and calculated cruelty. He didn't look up when I entered. He just pointed to the crystal decanter. "Drink, Dante. You look like you've seen a spirit." I poured a finger of scotch, my hand steady only through sheer force of will. "I found the list," I said, my voice a low rasp. My father finally looked up, his eyes 2 bottomless pits of charcoal. "And it's a clean job. The Romanov girl is the heart of their new operation. You cut out the heart, the body dies. It's business, son." I felt a sudden, violent urge to flip the desk, to tell him that she wasn't just a girl or a target, but I held it in. To show emotion was to show a target. "Why me?" I asked instead. My father smiled, a slow, terrifying expression. "Because loyalty isn't proven by what you're willing to do for the family. It's proven by what you're willing to give up." I spent the next 2 days in a state of hypervigilance, moving through the city like a man haunted. I knew my father's shadows were watching me, men tasked with ensuring the heir didn't falter. I had to make it look like I was hunting her. I visited the Romanov territories, checked their clubs, and put out feelers in the underworld. all while secretly trying to find a way to get her out of the city. The hit list was more than a command, it was a deadline. On the second night, a burner phone buzzed in my pocket. A single text, midnight, the old pier, alone. I knew the handwriting of that message without seeing a pen. It was the Romanov style, blunt and dangerous. My mind screamed that it was a trap, a bratva setup to take out the Morty heir, but my feet were already moving toward the garage. I couldn't kill her, but I couldn't stay away. I was a man caught in a crossfire of my own making, the contractor who had fallen for the target. The old pier was a skeleton of rotted wood and rusted iron, stretching out into the dark, churning waters of the lake. The wind howled through the gaps, sounding like the voices of the men I'd sent to the bottom of this very water. I stood at the end of the dock, my hand on the grip of my beretta, scanning the darkness. "You shouldn't have come," a voice said from behind a stack of shipping crates. Elena stepped into the moonlight, looking pale and ethereal, yet she held a compact Glock with the practiced ease of a professional. "I could say the same to you," I countered, not drawing my weapon. "The word is out, Elena. There's a price on your head." She took a step closer, the barrel of her gun lowering slightly. "I know. My father's consigliere told me. He also told me who took the contract." She looked at me, her eyes searching for the man she had kissed in the rain. "Are you going to do it, Dante? Are you going to be the good son?" The air between us was charged with a lethal electricity. "I tried to run after that kiss," I confessed, the truth tearing out of me. "I wanted to find you to tell you to hide. Then I found the list. My name is right next to yours. If I don't do it, they'll send Lorenzo. Or worse, a mercenary who won't make it quick." Elena's laugh was brittle. "So you're saying you're my best option for a funeral?" I surged forward, grabbing her by the shoulders, my heart hammering a drumbeat of war. "I'm saying we don't have time. My father is suspicious. He's already asking why the Ice Queen hasn't been melted yet." We stood there, two children of monsters, trying to find a way to survive the shadows that birthed us. "There's a safe house," she whispered, her forehead resting against mine. "In the North Woods. No one knows about it, not even my father." I looked into her eyes and saw the same desperation I felt. Choosing her was a betrayal of my blood, my oath, and my future. "If we go, we can never come back," I warned. "I know," she replied, "but I'd rather die with you than live because of them." We made it out of the city under the cover of a massive storm, the kind of torrential downpour that hides the movement of predators. We used a ghost car, an unregistered sedan from a private garage I kept for emergencies. I drove with one eye on the rearview mirror, expecting the headlights of a Morty hit squad at every turn. Elena sat beside me, her hand resting on the center console, fingers inches from mine, but never touching. The silence was a heavy thing, filled with the ghosts of the families we were leaving behind. "They'll find us eventually," she said softly, watching the blurred trees of the interstate. "My father doesn't lose his property, and your father doesn't lose his legacy." I tightened my grip on the wheel. "Then we make sure that when they find us, they regret it." I was breaking the Omertà, the one rule that kept us alive. In the eyes of the commission, I was already a dead man. I just hadn't stopped breathing yet. The safe house was a cabin tucked deep into a ravine, surrounded by towering pines that groaned in the wind. Inside, it was cold and smelled of cedar. We didn't turn on many lights. We moved through the rooms like specters, the weight of our shared secret keeping us apart even as it drew us together. That night, the tension finally snapped. We were in the small kitchen, the yellow light of a single bulb casting long shadows on the walls. I was cleaning my weapon out of habit, the click of the metal the only sound. "Why did you choose this life, Dante?" she asked, standing by the window. I looked up. "I didn't. I was born into it, just like you." She shook her head. "No. You have a heart. I felt it when you kissed me. Most of the men in our world are hollow. You're just wounded." I stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. "Don't romanticize me, Elena. I've done things that would make you sick." She walked toward me, her gaze unwavering. "Then show me the man behind the contractor." The passion that followed was a desperate, violent thing, a way to drown out the reality of the hit list. Every touch was an act of defiance, every kiss a rebellion. We were no longer heirs or rivals. We were just two people clinging to each other in the dark while the world outside planned our execution. But even in the eye of the storm, the subtext of our birthrights remained. As I held her, I saw the bruises on her arms from where her father had corrected her mistakes, and she saw the scars on my back from the lessons my father had taught me. We were bound by our trauma as much as our desire. "If they find us tonight," she whispered into the crook of my neck, "at least I'll know what it felt like to be loved by the enemy." I pulled her closer, the guilt of my name a heavy stone in my gut. "You're not the enemy anymore, Elena. You're the reason I'm finally standing up." 4 days of peace were all we were granted. I was outside, chopping wood to keep the fire going, when I saw the glint of sunlight off a lens in the trees. It was a sniper's scope. I didn't think. I just dived toward the porch as the first shot shattered the cabin's window. "Elena, DOWN," I screamed, pulling my Beretta. I dragged her into the center of the cabin, behind the stone fireplace. "They found us," she gasped, her face pale. "Is it my father or yours?" I didn't answer. I was busy counting the muzzle flashes. There were 4 of them, a standard hit squad. "It doesn't matter," I gritted out. "They're here for the contract." We fought back with a ferocity that came from the knowledge that there was nowhere left to run. Elena was a sharpshooter, her Glock barking rhythmically beside my Beretta. We moved in a lethal synchronization, a dance we had both been practicing for our entire lives, just with different partners. The skirmish ended as quickly as it began, leaving 3 bodies in the snow and 1 survivor who managed to scramble back into the woods. I stood over one of the fallen men and felt a cold pit open in my stomach. He was wearing a Morty ring. It was my father's inner circle. But as I turned the body over, I found a burner phone with a message that changed everything. It wasn't just my father who had sent them. There were coordinated coordinates from a Romanov server. Our fathers were working together. The border dispute had been a ruse to smoke us out, to see if the heirs were getting too close. They weren't fighting for territory. They were fighting to preserve the purity of their hatred. They had collaborated to kill us both to prevent an alliance that would threaten their absolute control. "Dante," Elena whispered, looking at the same phone, "they aren't trying to start a war. They're trying to end us." The realization hit me harder than any bullet could. Our fathers, the 2 most powerful men in the city, had set aside decades of animosity just to ensure we didn't defy the status quo. To them, we were just assets, and when an asset becomes a liability, you liquidate it. "We're not going back to Chicago," I said, my voice empty of anything but iron resolve. "We're going to the one place they won't expect us." Elena looked at me, her eyes hardening. "Where?" I grabbed the keys to the car. "To the sit-down. They're meeting tonight at the social club to finalize the peace treaty built on our corpses. We're going to crash the party." It was a suicide mission, and we both knew it. But there was a grim satisfaction in the idea of facing our creators together. We were no longer running. We were hunting. We drove back toward the city, the skyline appearing on the horizon like the fangs of a beast. I checked my magazines, my movements robotic. I thought about the first flashback, my father killing that man in the bakery. He had told me mercy was a luxury. Well, I was fresh out of luxury. I looked at Elena, who was loading a fresh clip into her weapon. "Are you ready to kill your father?" I asked. She didn't hesitate. "He killed the daughter I was years ago. This is just finishing the job." We reached the outskirts of the city, the rain beginning to fall again, mixing with the soot of the industrial district. We weren't just the contractor and the target anymore. We were the reckoning. But as we neared the gilded cage, a black SUV swerved across the road, forcing us to a screeching halt. Lorenzo stepped out of the SUV, alone, holding a semi-automatic rifle. I stepped out of our car, my weapon leveled at my brother's heart. "Step aside, Enzo," I warned. "I don't want to do this." Lorenzo looked at me, and for the first time in my life I saw tears in his eyes. "You idiot, Dante. Do you think I didn't know? I've been covering your tracks for days. I'm the one who told the Don you were in the South Side when you were really with her." I lowered my gun an inch, stunned. "Then why are you here?" Lorenzo gestured toward the city. "Because the sit-down isn't just about you. They've compromised the whole family. Father has sold out our lieutenants to the Romanovs to get their help in hunting you. He's destroying the Morty name to save his own ego." The betrayal was deeper than I had imagined. My father hadn't just targeted me. He had targeted our entire legacy. "They're waiting for you at the cage," Lorenzo said, his voice urgent. "But there's a bomb, Dante. They don't intend for anyone to leave that meeting alive once they have confirmation of your deaths. It's a clean slate. They're going to blame the Bratva will blame us, and the Dons will disappear with the offshore accounts while the rest of us burn." The complexity of the treachery was staggering. Our fathers weren't just killers. They were architects of a massacre. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Lorenzo stepped forward, handing me his rifle. "Because you're the only Morty left with a soul. Save the family, Dante, or what's left of it. I'll hold them off here." He looked past me at Elena, a faint nod of respect. "Run. You have 20 minutes." We tore through the city streets, the sirens in the distance sounding like a funeral dirge. The gilded cage looked the same as it had that first night, but now it felt like a mausoleum. We abandoned the car in the middle of the street and ran for the back entrance. I knew the layout by heart, every corridor and every camera. We bypassed the main floor, where the jazz was still playing to a crowd of oblivious socialites, and headed for the inner sanctum. My heart was a drum, my blood a river of fire. As we reached the heavy oak doors of the private room, I felt a vibration under my feet. The timer was close. I looked at Elena one last time, the weight of our entire history distilled into a single moment. "If we don't make it out," I began, but she silenced me with a hand on my chest. "We make it out. We're in charge now." I kicked the doors open. The room was exactly as it had been. The velvet, the lilies, the smell of vice. My father and Don Romanov sat at the table, a bottle of vintage scotch between them, looking like two old friends. They didn't look surprised to see us. In fact, they looked bored. "You're late, Dante," my father said, checking his gold pocket watch. "The contract was due an hour ago." I stood there, my rifle aimed at the man who gave me life, while Elena aimed her Glock at the man who gave her hers. "The contract is canceled," I said, my voice echoing in the chamber. "And so are you." My father laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "You think you can just walk in here and take over? You're a boy playing at being a man." He signaled to the shadows, and 6 of his elite guards stepped forward, their weapons trained on us. "This was never about a hit list, son. It was about proving you were too weak to lead. And you've proven me right." The tension in the room was a physical weight, a suffocating pressure that made it hard to breathe. "The bomb, father," I said, my voice steady. "Lorenzo told me. You're going to kill everyone in this building just to cover your tracks." My father's eyes narrowed. Lorenz always had too much of your mother in him. A shame. He looked at the guards. Take them. I want to watch my son realize his mistake before the end. This was the moment of choice. There were no more flashbacks, no more codes to hide behind. There was only the sound of a clock ticking somewhere in the walls and the look of cold, murderous intent in my father's eyes. This was the betrayal that would either forge a new future or bury us in the ruins of the old one. Now, I yelled, but instead of the guards firing at us, the room exploded in a different way. The lights went out and the sound of suppressed gunfire filled the air. But it wasn't coming from me. I felt Elena's hand grab mine in the dark, pulling me toward the floor. In the chaos, I realized that the guards weren't firing at us. They were firing at each other. The betrayal had layers I hadn't even begun to peel back. As the emergency lights flickered on, I saw a new figure standing in the doorway. It was the consigliere of the Romanovs, and he wasn't looking at his Don with loyalty. He was looking at the table with the hunger of a man who had been waiting for his turn for far too long. The coup was happening, and we were caught in the middle of 3 different wars at once. The bomb is in the basement, the consigliere said into a walkie-talkie, his voice calm over the screams of the dying. 10 minutes to detonation. Make sure the vault is secured. He looked at me and Elena, a cold smile on his face. Thank you for bringing the distraction, Dante. You made this very easy. I looked at my father, who was slumped over the table, a bullet hole in his chest. He was dead before I ever had the chance to pull the trigger. The man who had haunted my dreams was gone, replaced by a new monster. Elena was staring at her own father, who was gasping for air on the floor, clutching a wound in his neck. The power structure of the city had crumbled in seconds, and we were the only ones left standing in the rubble. We have to go, I whispered, grabbing Elena's arm, but she was transfixed by the carnage. It's over, Dante. Everything is gone. I shook her hard. No, it's just beginning, but we have to move now or we die in the fire. We turned to run for the exit, but the consigliere's men blocked the path. We were trapped in a room full of dead kings, with a ticking clock underneath us and an army of usurpers in front of us. This wasn't a romance anymore. It was an escape from hell. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and blood, the same smell I had known my whole life, but now it felt final. One way out, I said, looking at the large bay window that overlooked the rain-slicked streets of the city. We jump or we burn. We took a running start, our hands locked together, the glass shattering around us like stars in the midnight sky. As we plummeted toward the awning below, the world seemed to slow down. I saw the reflections of the neon signs, the dark shapes of the cars, and the face of the woman who had cost me everything and given me back my soul. We hit the fabric with a bone-jarring thud and rolled onto the sidewalk just as the building above us erupted in a roar of orange flame. The concussion waved through us into the street, the heat of the blast searing the back of my coat. I looked up to see the gilded cage, the place where we had first met, where we had first kissed, collapsing into a pile of charred velvet and broken vice. I struggled to my feet, my ears ringing, the taste of ash in my mouth. I found Elena a few feet away, covered in soot but alive. We stood in the middle of the street, the rain washing the debris from our faces, staring at the ruins of our former lives. We were alone, no family, no territory, no protection. We were the most wanted people in the city, hunted by the survivors of both organizations. But for the first time in my life, I didn't see a hit list when I looked at her. I saw a future. What now? She asked, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. I reached into my pocket and found the last thing I had left, the ring my father had given me, the symbol of the Moretti heir. I threw it into the gutter. Now, I said, We show them what happens when you leave the survivors with nothing left to lose. But as I spoke, the black SUVs of the internal security forces began to circle the block, their sirens screaming a final, deadly warning. We were out of the fire, but we were far from safe. The sirens were a choir of scavengers, howling through the smoke as the gilded cage burned behind us. I stood on the rain-slicked pavement, my lungs burning with the ghost of the explosion, and looked at Elena. She was covered in the soot of our history, her eyes reflecting the orange glow of the pyre where our fathers had died. The black SUVs were circling, closing the perimeter with the cold efficiency of sharks sensing blood in the water. This was the moment I had feared since I first saw her name on that list. The moment where there was no more family to hide behind, no more code to follow, and no more road to run. I reached for her hand, my fingers interlacing with hers, and felt the tremor in her grip. "Dante," she whispered, the sound nearly lost to the roar of the fire. "We're trapped." I looked at the approaching headlights, the glare blinding and merciless. "Not yet," I said, my voice sounding like gravel. "We didn't survive the fire just to surrender to the shadows." The SUVs halted, doors swinging open in a synchronized motion that spoke of high-level training. These weren't just Morty soldiers or Romanov thugs. These were the cleaners, the tactical wing of the commission, the shadowy council that presided over all 5 families. They were here to sanitize the mess our fathers had left behind, and that meant making us disappear. A man stepped forward into the light, his face indistinguishable behind a tactical mask. "Dante Moretti, Elena Romanov. You are out of time," he announced, his voice amplified by a megaphone. "The contract on the Romanov girl is still active. The contract on the Moretti heir was authorized 10 minutes ago by the surviving consiglieres. You have 2 choices. End it yourselves, or we end it for you." I felt Elena's grip tighten until it was painful. This was the ultimate realization of the Mafia's cruelty. Our fathers were dead, their empires in ashes, and yet the machine they built was still grinding forward, demanding the blood it was promised. "I won't let them take you," I said, leaning closer so only she could hear. I scanned the street, looking for the one opening I knew existed, the old subway entrance 2 blocks down, a relic of a forgotten Chicago. "When I say go, you run for the stairs. Don't look back. Don't wait for me." Elena pulled me around to face her, her eyes blazing with a fierce, desperate light. "No, we chose this together, Dante. I'm not running while you play the martyr." The sirens were getting closer, the blue and red lights of the legitimate police beginning to flicker in the distance, a second wave of trouble we didn't have time for. "Elena, listen to me," I gritted out, my hands framing her face. "They want the contractor and the target. If I stay and give them a fight, you can disappear. You can be the one who got away." She shook her head, a single tear cutting a path through the soot on her cheek. "I'm not the target anymore. I'm yours, and you're mine. That's the only law left." The cleaners didn't wait for our debate. They moved with a predatory grace, raising their suppressed submachine guns. I shoved Elena behind a parked sedan just as the first rhythmic thuds of lead-hitting metal echoed through the street. The glass of the car shattered above our heads, raining down like diamonds. I pulled my last magazine from my belt, my movements fluid despite the adrenaline screaming in my veins. "I tried to run after that kiss," I muttered to myself, a bitter smile touching my lips. "I should have known a Morty never gets to run." I popped up, firing a controlled burst that forced the front line back, then grabbed Elena's arm. "Now, the subway." We bolted across the asphalt, the world transformed into a blur of gunfire and neon. Every step was a gamble, every breath a prayer to a god I hadn't spoken to in years. We hit the stairs of the old station just as a concussion grenade detonated behind us, the world turning white for a dizzying second. The subway tunnels were a tomb of damp concrete and the smell of ancient iron. We ran through the darkness, the only light coming from the sparks of our footfalls on the rusted tracks. We could hear the cleaners behind us, their heavy boots echoing like the ticking of a doomsday clock. "This way," I whispered, pulling her into a maintenance crawl space I had scouted years ago for a smuggling route that never materialized. We huddled together in the narrow, lightless gap, our heartbeats at odds with each other, mine a frantic staccato, hers a steady, rhythmic thrumming of defiance. The air was thick with the dust of decades. Elena leaned her head against my shoulder, her breath warm against my neck. "They're going to find us, aren't they?" she asked, her voice devoid of fear, filled only with a quiet acceptance. I held her closer, the cold steel of my gun resting against her leg. "Maybe, but they'll have to pay a much higher price than they negotiated for." In the silence of the tunnel, the memories of the last few days played like a film strip in the back of my mind. I saw the look on my father's face when I kicked that door open, the shock buried under a layer of narcissistic disappointment. I saw Lorenzo standing alone on that road, sacrificing himself to give us 20 minutes. I realized then that my life had been a series of cages, each one smaller than the last, until all that was left was this 4-foot space of brick and shadow. But in this smallest cage, for the first time, I wasn't alone. I had found the one soul in the city that was as broken and beautiful as my own. "Elena," I said, my voice barely a breath, "if this is the end, I don't regret finding that list, because it led me back to you." She didn't respond with words. She just found my hand in the dark and squeezed it, a silent pact that transcended any Omertà. The sound of the cleaners faded as they moved past our hiding spot, their voices echoing further down the main line towards the river. I waited, counting the seconds, my senses tuned to the subtle shifts in the air. "We have to move," I said, checking my watch. "There's an access hatch half a mile up that leads to the docks. If we can reach the waterfront, I have a contact with a boat. We can be across the lake by dawn." Elena nodded, pulling her hair back into a tight knot. She looked at the Glock in her hand, then at me. "And after that? Where do we go when the whole world is a target?" I looked toward the faint glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. "We go where they don't have a name for us. We go where we're just Dante and Elena." It was a beautiful lie, a dream of a life we weren't meant to have, but it was the only thing keeping us moving through the muck and the misery. We reached the access hatch, the rusted rungs of the ladder groaning under our weight. I pushed the heavy iron cover aside and peered out into the cool, salt-tinged air of the Chicago docks. The fog was rolling in off Lake Michigan, a thick gray shroud that was more effective than any camouflage. We climbed out onto the pier, the silence of the waterfront eerie compared to the chaos of the city. We moved toward the end of the dock, where an old fishing trawler, the Maria, was bobbing in the water. My contact, a man named Sal who owed me his life and a dozen secrets, was waiting at the helm. He didn't ask questions. He just pointed to the cabin, but as we stepped onto the gangplank, a single red dot appeared on the center of my chest. Then another appeared on Elena's forehead. A sniper. "Don't move," a voice commanded from the top of a stacked container. "The boat isn't going anywhere." It was the Romanov consigliere, the man who had survived the fire and the coup. He stood on the edge of the container, a sleek rifle slung over his shoulder, looking down at us like we were insects. Beside him stood a man of honor from my own family, a man I had called uncle since I was a child. The betrayal was complete. The two families hadn't just combined to kill us. They had merged into something new, a singular entity of greed that had no room for the old blood. "You two are the last loose ends," the consigliere said, his voice carrying clearly over the water. "The world thinks you died in the gilded cage. Why ruin a perfectly good story by actually surviving?" I looked at the sniper dots, feeling the finality of it. My finger was on the trigger of my Beretta, but I knew I wouldn't be fast enough. I looked at Elena, and for a fleeting second I saw her childhood, the little girl who had no idea she was born into a war. I saw the woman who had dared to kiss Omertà. "Let her go," I shouted, stepping in front of her, shielding her with my body. "The contract has my name as the contractor. I failed the job. Take me. Leave her out of this." The consigliere laughed, a hollow, echoing sound. "You're still romanticizing this, Dante. There are no heroes here, just business." Elena stepped out from behind me, her chin tilted up, her eyes bright with a defiance that made the sniper's dot dance across her brow. "Then stop talking and do it. But know this, you've already lost. You killed the men who built this city, and all you have left are the ashes." A single shot rang out, but the red dots didn't disappear. I flinched, waiting for the impact, but it didn't come from the sniper. Instead, the consigliere's body jerked and tumbled from the container, falling into the black water with a dull thump. From the shadows of the warehouse behind them, a figure emerged. It was Lorenzo. He was bleeding from a wound in his side, his face pale and haggard, but he held his rifle with a steady, vengeful hand. He had survived the SUV ambush and followed the cleaners. "The contract is closed," Lorenzo shouted, his voice cracking with the effort. He fired again, taking out the sniper on the crane before the man could react. In the ensuing confusion, I grabbed Elena and dove for the deck of the boat. "Sal, G.O. "Now!" I roared. The engine of the trawler roared to life, churning the water into a white froth. Lorenzo stood on the dock as the boat began to pull away. He looked at me, a ghost of a smile on his face, a silent goodbye from a brother who had finally found a way to be free. He turned back toward the warehouse, where the headlights of the cleaner's SUV were appearing, and raised his rifle one last time. He wasn't coming with us. He was staying behind to ensure the trail died with him. "Lorenzo!" I screamed, but the wind and the engine drowned me out. Elena held me, her arms wrapped tightly around my waist, as we watched the silhouette of my brother vanish into the mist and the muzzle flashes. He was the price we paid for our freedom. He was the piece of the family that sacrificed itself so the heart could keep beating. The city of Chicago began to shrink as we hit the open water, the skyline a jagged crown of fire and light against the dark sky. We sat on the deck, the cold spray of the lake washing the grime from our skin. I looked at the Beretta in my hand, the weapon that had defined my identity for so long, and threw it into the deep, dark water. I watched it sink, a small ripple in a vast ocean of secrets. Elena sat beside me, her head resting on my shoulder, her hand clutching the crumpled hit list she had pulled from my pocket at some point during the night. She looked at it for a long time, then tore it into 100 tiny pieces and let the wind take them. They drifted away like gray moths, disappearing into the fog. "We're ghosts now, Dante," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "No names, no families, no past." I looked at her, seeing the woman I had risked everything for. She was beautiful, even with the scars and the shadows under her eyes. "I can live with being a ghost," I said, "as long as I'm haunted by you." We sat there in the silence, watching the dawn begin to break over the horizon, a pale, weak light that offered no promises, only the chance to see another day. We had lost everything. Our homes, our heritages, our brothers. We had broken every rule of the world we were born into. But as the sun touched the water, I realized we had gained the one thing no Don or consigliere could ever truly be: Years later, in a small coastal town where the language was different and the rain felt clean, I would still wake up in the middle of the night, reaching for a gun that wasn't there. I would still check the shadows of every cafe, looking for the red glint of a sniper's dot. The mafia doesn't just leave you. It's a stain on the soul that never quite fades. But then I would feel Elena beside me, her breathing steady and peaceful, and the ghosts of Chicago would retreat back into the mist. I had tried to run after that kiss, and it had led me through a valley of death and betrayal. I had found a hit list with my name on it, and it had ended up being my map to salvation. We never went back. We never looked up the news from the South Side or the North Side. We let the world believe the heirs of the Moretti and Romanov families had perished in the flames of the gilded cage. Sometimes on the anniversary of that night, I would sit on the beach and watch the waves, thinking about Lorenz and the bakery basement and the white dress of my sister. I would think about the codes I broke and the men I killed. But then I would look at the house on the hill, where the lights were warm and the air smelled of jasmine, and I would know that I had made the right choice. In the dark world of the mafia, love is a death sentence. But for us, it was the only thing that allowed us to live. The final image of my past is always that rain-slicked alleyway, the taste of her lips, and the weight of that paper in my hand. I remember the terror of that moment, the feeling of the trap closing in. But as I sit here now, with the sun on my face and the woman I love by my side, I realize that the hit list wasn't the end of my story. It was the prologue. I had to become the contractor to understand that I didn't want to kill. I had to become the target to understand that I wanted to survive. My name is Dante, and I am no longer a Moretti. I am just a man who found a reason to stay. The city lights of Chicago are 1,000 miles away now, and the neon sins are someone else's burden. I look at Elena, who is standing by the water, her dark hair catching the light of the setting sun. She turns and smiles at me, a genuine, radiant expression that has no subtext of threat or power. It's a smile of peace. I walk toward her, my footsteps leaving prints in the sand that the tide will soon wash away. Everything we were is gone, and everything we are is right here in this moment under this sky. The midnight mafia romance had a violent beginning and a tragic middle, but as I take her hand, I know that we've finally reached the end. And for the first time in my life, the end is exactly where I want to be. The waves continue to roll in, timeless and indifferent to the wars of men. Somewhere, a new heir is being sworn in, a new hit list is being typed, and a new kiss is being shared in the shadows of a social club. The world we left behind will always be there, a cycle of blood and betrayal that never stops turning. But as the stars begin to appear above the ocean, I realize that we are the lucky ones. We are the ones who escape the gravity of our own destinies. I pull Elena closer, the scent of the salt and the jasmine filling my senses, and I whisper a silent thank you to the ghosts who let us go. The contractor has retired, the target has vanished, and the only list that matters now is the one we write ourselves, one day at a time. This is our Omertà, the silence of a life well lived, far from the reach of the shadows.